James Donovan sat in his sleek, glass-walled office, staring at the sprawling cityscape below. Everything he had ever dreamed of, everything he had worked tirelessly to achieve, was within his grasp. Yet, he felt a gnawing emptiness deep inside. The luxury cars, penthouse apartments, lavish vacations, they were all just things. And things, he had learned, couldn't fill the void in his heart. It wasn't the money he regretted, but what it had done to the people around him. His relationships felt transactional. His friends, if they could even be called that, seemed to care more about what they could get from him than who he really was. He longed for something genuine. It had been months since the idea first took root in his mind. He had been flipping through channels one night, landing on a documentary about homelessness. As the camera panned over rows of people huddled in makeshift shelters, it hit him. What if he became one of them? Not truly, of course, but what if he disguised himself as someone who had lost everything? Could he find someone who saw him not as a millionaire, but as a fellow human in need? His mind was made up. That night, he sat down at his desk and began sketching out the plan. He would strip away all the trappings of his wealth, go out into the streets, and see how people reacted to him. But more importantly, he would search for someone with a good heart, someone who would help not because of a reward, but because they believed in kindness. The next morning, James pulled some old clothes out of his closet, items he hadn't worn in years. A faded gray hoodie, torn jeans, and worn-out sneakers. He even went to a thrift store to find some extras, an old coat with frayed cuffs, a hat pulled low over his eyes, and a rough blanket he could drape over himself. It wasn't enough to look disheveled, he needed to feel it too. He stopped shaving and let his beard grow out, long enough to look scruffy but not too suspicious. His usual sharp, clean-shaven look was replaced by someone who looked weathered by life. When he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. Perfect, he thought. On a cold Monday morning, James stepped out of his penthouse, leaving behind his polished life, and walked towards the busier parts of the city. The plan was simple. He would sit on a street corner for the day, holding a sign asking for help. He didn't expect much at first. Maybe some pity, maybe a few coins tossed his way. What he really wanted was to see if anyone would care enough to engage with him. To ask about his story. To see the person beneath the dirt-streaked clothes and tired eyes. As he found his spot on a bustling street, he sat down and held the sign in his lap, lost everything. Anything helps. People walked by in waves. Most barely glanced his way, too absorbed in their phones, conversations, or simply avoiding eye contact. Occasionally, someone would drop a coin or two into the small cup he had placed beside him, but no one stopped. Hours passed, the sun climbed high in the sky, and the air grew warmer, but inside, James felt a growing chill. Was this how people always treated those they thought had nothing? The hours dragged on, and the steady stream of people walking by never seemed to slow. James sat in his spot, his back pressed against the cold brick wall behind him, holding the sign loosely in his hands. His body ached from sitting on the hard pavement, but it was nothing compared to the ache growing in his chest. This wasn't just an experiment anymore. It was a harsh reality he hadn't expected to feel so deeply. Most people didn't even glance at him. They passed by as if he were invisible, a fixture in the city that didn't require their attention. A few, usually dressed in business suits or nice dresses, would give him a quick look of disgust or disapproval, as if his very presence offended them. Others, wrapped in their own worries, walked past without a second thought. It was like being on the other side of a glass wall. He could see them, but they refused to see him. Occasionally, a person would drop some loose change into his cup, but they never made eye contact. The coins would clink, A small reminder that some still had the capacity for sympathy, but it was distant, almost impersonal. The generosity was more of an afterthought, like throwing breadcrumbs to a bird without caring whether it ate or not. Around noon, a middle-aged woman approached, holding a takeout cup of coffee in one hand and a phone in the other. She paused briefly in front of him, frowning as she read his sign. James straightened slightly, hopeful she might say something, anything. But instead, she dug into her purse and dropped a dollar bill into his cup without looking at him. Her phone rang, and she answered it immediately, already turning away. "Yeah, I'm on my way. Just helping one of those people, you know? So sad," she said, her voice full of practiced compassion. James sighed as she walked off, feeling more disconnected than ever. It wasn't the money he cared about, he had no use for it. It was the fact that no one saw him as a person. They saw the ragged clothes, the unkempt beard, the dirty face, and they assumed he was nothing but a failure, someone who had made poor choices or simply didn't matter. By mid-afternoon, James had lost count of how many people had passed by. His legs were stiff from sitting so long, his stomach growling from hunger. He had decided not to bring any food with him. Part of the experience, he reasoned, was to feel the same discomfort many homeless people faced every day. As the sky began to turn orange with the setting sun, he considered packing up and leaving. The day had been long and discouraging, and he hadn't found what he was looking for. He had hoped that maybe, just maybe, someone would stop and ask how he was doing. That someone would treat him like a human being. Just as he was about to stand, a man approached. He didn't look much better off than James. His coat was frayed at the edges, his shoes scuffed and worn, and his hands were rough, like someone who had spent his life working hard for very little. He had kind eyes, though, and as he came closer, James noticed that he wasn't in any rush like the others. He wasn't on his phone or looking away. The man, whose name James would later learn was Ethan, crouched down beside him, meeting his eyes for the first time that day. "Hey, man," Ethan said softly. "You okay?" James blinked, momentarily stunned. Someone had stopped, not to toss him spare change, not to pity him, but to actually talk to him. I'm getting by," James said, his voice hoarse from hours of silence. Ethan nodded, as if he understood. "It's rough out here, huh?" "Yeah," James replied, surprised at how natural it felt to talk to this stranger. "It's been a tough day." Ethan sat down next to him on the pavement, not caring about the dirt or the cold seeping through his coat. He pulled a sandwich out of his bag and unwrapped it. Without a word, he handed half of it to James. "Here," Ethan said, "you look like you could use this." James hesitated. He hadn't eaten all day, and his stomach was screaming for food, but it felt wrong to take this man's meal. Ethan didn't look like he had much to spare, and yet, here he was, offering it without a second thought. "I can't take this from you," James said, shaking his head. "You need it more than I do." Ethan smiled, a warm, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "We all need something, man. It's just a sandwich. I can always get another one." Reluctantly, James accepted the food, and as he took a bite, he felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't just the taste of the sandwich that made him emotional. It was the simple, unspoken kindness behind it. Ethan didn't know who he was, didn't care whether he was rich or poor. All he saw was another person in need, and that was enough for him. They sat in silence for a while, eating and watching the world go by. James couldn't remember the last time he had felt so comfortable with a stranger. After a few minutes, Ethan spoke again. "So, what's your story, man? How do you end up out here?" James paused, considering his answer. He had prepared a fake backstory for situations like this, something that would make his experiment more believable. But looking at Ethan, he found himself wanting to be honest, or at least, as honest as he could without revealing his true identity. "I lost everything," James said quietly, his eyes downcast. "Work, home, friends, it all fell apart. I don't know how it got this bad." Ethan nodded slowly, as if he understood every word. "Yeah, life can do that to you sometimes. It knocks you down when you least expect it." There was no judgment in Ethan's voice, no pity, just understanding. It was as if he had been there himself, as if he knew exactly how it felt to lose everything. "You got anyone looking out for you?" Ethan asked after a moment. "Family, friends?" James shook his head. "No one." "Well, you do now," Ethan said with a smile. "I'm Ethan, by the way." James smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "I'm James." They shook hands, and for the first time all day, James felt seen. Not as a homeless man, not as a failure, but as a human being. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the streetlights flickered on, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $10 bill. He pressed it into James's hand. "Take this," Ethan said, his tone serious. "It's not much, but it'll help you get something warm to eat tonight." James stared at the money in his hand, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew how little Ethan had, how much that $10 meant to him. And yet, Ethan gave it without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. I can't take this," James stammered, shaking his head. "You need it." "Hey," Ethan said, his voice gentle but firm, "we all need help sometimes. Just promise me you'll pay it forward when you can, okay?" James swallowed hard, nodding. "I will, I promise." Ethan stood up, brushing the dirt off his coat. "Take care of yourself, James. And don't lose hope. Things can get better, even when it feels like they won't." With that, Ethan turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. James watched him go, the $10 bill clutched tightly in his hand, his mind racing. He had found what he was looking for, someone with a pure heart, someone who didn't care about wealth or status, someone who helped simply because it was the right thing to do. But more than that, he had found something he hadn't even realized he needed: hope. James remained seated on the cold pavement long after Ethan disappeared into the night. The half-eaten sandwich and the crumpled $10 bill weighed heavily in his hands. In all the months of preparing for this moment, for this experiment, James had never expected to feel this overwhelmed. The plan had been simple: go undercover, experience the way society treats the homeless, and find someone who still had a shred of decency, someone with a pure heart. And now, in the most unexpected way, he had found that person. Ethan's kindness had been raw, genuine, and it wasn't just the sandwich or the money. It was the way Ethan had spoken to him, as if he truly mattered, as if James was worth more than the sum of his tattered clothes and fake backstory. For the first time in years, James felt truly seen, not as the young millionaire who could buy whatever he wanted, but as a person who needed connection, care, and understanding. James tucked the $10 bill carefully into his pocket and stood up, his mind already racing with thoughts of what he could do for Ethan. He had the means to change this man's life, to lift him out of poverty, to give him opportunities he had never dreamed of. But James knew that whatever he did, it couldn't feel like charity. Ethan's pride was evident in every word, in the way he carried himself despite his worn-out clothes. He didn't need a handout, he needed a break, a chance. With a newfound resolve, James walked back to his penthouse, his mind spinning with possibilities. This wasn't just about repaying Ethan's kindness, it was about giving him what he truly deserved: a life that reflected the goodness in his heart. The next morning, James woke early. The city was already bustling, but James felt like he was seeing it with fresh eyes. Every person he passed on the street felt different to him now. He had been one of the invisible for a day, and it had changed him in ways he couldn't fully comprehend yet. Back in his penthouse, surrounded by the trappings of wealth, fine art, designer furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the entire skyline, James found it almost surreal to think about the contrast between his life and Ethan's. He pulled out his laptop and began to search for everything he could about Ethan. He had caught a glimpse of his last name on a business card Ethan had handed someone while walking away the night before. Ethan Campbell. A few searches later, James had a profile. Ethan Campbell, 34 years old, worked part-time as a mechanic at a small garage downtown. He lived in a modest, run-down apartment on the edge of the city and, as James had suspected, was deeply in debt. Medical bills for his sick mother had piled up over the years, and he had been struggling to make ends meet for a long time. It was even worse than James had imagined. Ethan wasn't just struggling, he was drowning. But he had never let that stop him from being kind. That fact alone made James more determined than ever. James sat back in his chair and smiled to himself. It was time to put the next phase of his plan into motion. A few days later, Ethan returned to his normal routine, unaware of the change that was about to unfold. His mornings started early, working long hours at the garage, earning just enough to cover rent and some of the mounting bills. It had been a hard week, but Ethan never complained. There was always something worse happening to someone else, and he was thankful that at least he had work, however modest it was. That morning, as he opened the door to his small apartment, he found a crisp white envelope lying on the welcome mat. Frowning, he picked it up and flipped it over. No return address, no markings, just his name, written in neat handwriting. Confused, Ethan opened the envelope and pulled out a folded letter. The message inside was brief but unmistakable. "Thank you for your kindness. You have no idea how much it meant to me. I hope this helps you as much as you helped me. James." Ethan's brow furrowed in confusion as he unfolded a second piece of paper. It was a cashier's check. His heart nearly stopped when he saw the amount, $100,000. His hands trembled as he stared at the number, his mind racing. This had to be a mistake. $100,000? Who was this James? The man he had met on the street? The one with the scruffy beard and worn-out clothes? It didn't make sense. There was no way that man could have had this kind of money. It had to be some kind of scam, right? But the more Ethan thought about it, the more it started to make sense. James had been different. There had been something in his eyes, something that didn't quite fit the rest of his appearance. Maybe he wasn't who Ethan thought he was. But that still didn't explain the money. For the rest of the day, Ethan's mind raced with questions. He couldn't bring himself to cash the check. Instead, he tucked it carefully into his pocket, telling himself he'd figure it out later. That evening, as Ethan finished his shift at the garage, he stepped outside to find a sleek black car waiting for him at the curb. He blinked, staring at it in disbelief. A man in a tailored suit stood next to the car, holding the door open. "Mr. Campbell?" the man asked with a polite smile. Ethan nodded, still unsure of what was happening. "The car is for you. There's someone who'd like to meet with you," the man said, gesturing for him to get inside. Ethan hesitated, but something told him this had to do with James. And despite his confusion, a part of him was curious. So, with a deep breath, he climbed into the car. The ride was quiet, and Ethan's mind raced with possibilities. When the car finally pulled up to a high-end restaurant downtown, Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. This place was far beyond anything he could afford. Inside, the maitre d' greeted him by name and led him to a private dining room in the back. As the door opened, Ethan saw him, James. But this time, James wasn't the scruffy man from the street. He was impeccably dressed in a sharp suit, his beard neatly trimmed, and his eyes filled with warmth. "Ethan," James said, standing up from the table and offering a hand. "It's good to see you again." Ethan stared at him in disbelief. "James? What is this?" James smiled and gestured for Ethan to sit down. "I owe you an explanation." Over the course of the meal, James told Ethan everything, about his wealth, about the experiment, and most importantly, about how deeply Ethan's kindness had impacted him. He explained that he had been searching for someone like Ethan, someone who still believed in helping others, even when they had little to give. Ethan listened in stunned silence, his mind struggling to process everything. When James finally finished, Ethan shook his head, still in disbelief. "I don't know what to say," Ethan murmured. I did what anyone would do." James smiled softly. "That's where you're wrong. Not everyone would do what you did. Most people walked by without a second thought. You didn't just help me, you saw me. And that's why I want to help you now." James leaned forward, his eyes sincere. "The money is just the beginning, Ethan. I want to help you get back on your feet. I know about your mother, your debt. I can take care of that. But more than that, I want to offer you something else, an opportunity. Come work for me. I need someone like you in my company, someone with integrity, someone who values people for who they are, not for what they have." Ethan sat back, speechless. A job? A chance to start over? It was more than he had ever dreamed of. "But why me?" Ethan asked, his voice thick with emotion. I'm nobody." James shook his head. "You're not nobody, Ethan. You're someone who reminded me of what really matters in life. And that's worth everything." Ethan sat in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of James's offer sinking in. His mind raced, his heart pounded in his chest, and he could barely grasp the enormity of what was happening. A job? His debts wiped away? It all sounded too good to be true, and for a moment, he was certain this had to be a dream. He'd wake up in his cramped apartment, with the same struggles waiting for him as always. But when he looked across the table at James, the sincerity in his eyes shattered that disbelief. This wasn't a dream, this was real. Ethan leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. "James, I don't even know how to thank you. I'm not sure I can accept all of this. It's too much." James's expression softened, and he leaned in, his voice calm but firm. "Ethan, I'm not doing this because I expect something in return. I'm doing this because you deserve it. You didn't hesitate to help me when you thought I had nothing. You gave me your last $10 when you could barely afford to eat yourself. That kind of heart, that kind of generosity, it's rare. And it's worth more than all the money I have." Ethan swallowed hard, emotion rising in his throat. Part of him still resisted the idea of accepting such a gift. He had always been the one to take care of others, to carry his own burdens, and to help without asking for anything in return. To be on the receiving end of such immense kindness felt foreign, almost uncomfortable. But another part of him, a part he had buried under years of hardship, longed for a break. The weight of his debts, his mother's medical bills, the constant struggle to stay afloat, it had worn him down. Maybe, just maybe, this was the chance he had been waiting for. A chance to rebuild, to start fresh. Ethan met James's gaze, his voice quiet but steady. "If I say yes, if I take this opportunity, I won't let you down. I don't know much about big business or fancy jobs, but I work hard. I always have." James smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "That's all I'm asking for, Ethan. Hard work, and that same integrity that made you help me that night. The rest, we can figure out together." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Ethan finally allowed himself to exhale, as if he had been holding his breath for days. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay you for this," Ethan said, his voice thick with gratitude. "You already have," James replied softly. "You reminded me of something I'd lost sight of, something more valuable than money. You reminded me of the importance of human connection, of kindness. That's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life." Over the next few weeks, Ethan's life transformed in ways he had never imagined. At first, the changes felt surreal, as if he had been dropped into someone else's reality. But slowly, he adjusted, with James guiding him every step of the way. The first major change came when James personally accompanied Ethan to the bank to settle his debts. As they stood at the counter and the banker handed over the paperwork showing that every single bill had been paid, Ethan felt a weight lift off his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he had been carrying for years. He could finally breathe again, no longer suffocated by the constant pressure of owing money he could never repay. Next came the job offer. James wasn't just giving Ethan a position at his company. He was offering him a real chance to grow. Ethan started at the company in a project management role, one that would challenge him but also allow him to learn and develop new skills. James made sure that Ethan received the necessary training and paired him with a mentor to help him adjust to the corporate environment. At first, Ethan felt like a fish out of water in the polished office spaces, surrounded by people who had years of experience in business. But his natural work ethic, honesty, and willingness to learn quickly earned him respect among his colleagues. Slowly but surely, he began to find his footing. Every day, James would check in with Ethan, not just as a boss, but as a friend. They would have lunch together, discussing work, life, and everything in between. The bond they had formed on that cold night on the street only deepened as they spent more time together. Ethan still couldn't fully grasp how a simple act of kindness had brought him here, but he was determined to make the most of it. As Ethan's professional life began to stabilize, his personal life also flourished. The most immediate and meaningful change came when he was able to move his mother into a better facility where she could receive proper care for her health issues. For years, Ethan had struggled to keep up with her medical needs, constantly worried that he wasn't doing enough. But now, for the first time, he felt at peace knowing she was in good hands. One day, after visiting his mother, Ethan returned to his new apartment, one James had helped him secure. It wasn't a penthouse like James's, but it was a comfortable, clean space in a safe neighborhood. As Ethan stood in the middle of the living room, he marveled at how much had changed in such a short time. He had gone from living paycheck to paycheck, barely surviving, to having stability, security, and a future he could actually look forward to. The $10 bill Ethan had given to James still sat on a shelf in his new place, carefully framed. It served as a reminder of where he had come from, and how far he had come since. Though his financial situation had improved, Ethan never lost the humility and generosity that had brought him to this point. He often found himself thinking about the people he had passed on the street during his own hard times, wondering if they, too, were waiting for someone to extend a hand, to give them a chance. He made it a personal mission to help others whenever he could, whether through donating to shelters, volunteering his time, or simply offering a kind word to those who needed it. Months later, Ethan found himself walking down the same busy street where he had first met James. It was a chilly evening, and as he passed the familiar storefronts and street corners, he thought back to that fateful night. His life had changed so drastically since then, and he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for everything that had happened. As he walked, he noticed a young man sitting on the sidewalk, holding a sign much like the one James had held. Ethan stopped, his heart tightening at the sight. The young man looked up, his face etched with exhaustion and uncertainty. Without a second thought, Ethan crouched down beside him, just as James had done with him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $20 bill, pressing it into the young man's hand. "Hey," Ethan said softly. "It's tough, I know. But things can get better. Trust me, just don't lose hope." The young man blinked in surprise, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, I don't know what to say." Ethan smiled, standing up and offering the man a warm nod. "You don't have to say anything. Just pay it forward when you can, okay?" As Ethan walked away, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. It wasn't about the money, it never had been. It was about the connection, the understanding, and the willingness to see people as they were, beyond their circumstances. And in that moment, Ethan realized that James's gift had done more than just change his financial situation. It had changed his heart, too. And now, it was his turn to pass that gift on to others. James's experiment had started as a way to find someone with a good heart, someone who would help without expecting anything in return. What he hadn't anticipated was the ripple effect of that kindness. By helping Ethan, James hadn't just changed one man's life. He had created a cycle of compassion that would continue far beyond that single moment. For James, the lesson was clear. True wealth wasn't in the money he had amassed, but in the connections he made and the kindness he gave. And for Ethan, the lesson was equally profound. No matter how little you have, you always have the power to make a difference. In the end, it wasn't about the experiment, the money, or the social status. It was about something much simpler, much more human. It was about recognizing the worth in others, and realizing that the smallest acts of kindness can create the biggest changes.